Hello, welcome back everybody. It's been a minute and it's me Amir here and I'm back with a new video. And in this video, we are going to look at how to implement CRUD operation with Supabase and React Native Expo app. Now, if you look here, we have this simple expense tracker application and we're going to create this by implementing CRUD operations to our backend or the database. Now, we'll be using Supabase as I've said. Now, let's just see a demo of how this works. So let's say I have these entries here, like 120 as the amount and the category will be rent. And I can add some short description here. And then I can just add this to list of my expenses and the entry will be registered in our database. And then we will read that. And that's why you can see this card here. It shows rent as category and the amount is 120 and the description is rent paid. We can as well delete an expense from this. So let's just click on delete button and you can clearly see the item is deleted. We can also update our entry. So I'll just update this. Let's say the price is 350. And then click on update and you can clearly see the item has successfully been updated. Now, if you are asking what Supabase is basically backend as a service and it's going to provide developers with various backend services like authentication, real-time database, secure storage, edge function, and Supabase is going to support multiple stacks like React.js, Next.js, Swift, Kotlin, React Native with Expo, and then Flutter. Now, the advantage of Supabase is that you do not need to create your own backend server from scratch. Supabase is going to manage all that, and it is going to give you some functions which you can use in your front end in order to interact with your backend. And the interesting fact is that I have an application that is published to Google Play Store, and this app right here is an AI recipe generator and calorie tracker application. And I built this application using React Native with Expo and Supabase for the backend. And we can just go through the store listing. We have this here. You can track your calories daily, and as well you can log meals to your application, and then you can also generate recipes using this AI recipe generator, and you can track your macros based on period like daily, weekly, monthly, and you can also personalize your goals by setting the target calories that you want to achieve. And this is it about the application. Before we start building our CRUD app, I would like us to go through this data flow, and it's really important to understand this data flow because understanding it is halfway to writing a clean and scalable code. So if you look here, we have home screen, and this home screen is going to hold some state variables like expenses and editing expenses. We are also going to fetch data on mount, and we render this transaction form and the transaction card. Now, if you look at the transaction form, we have this ability to update or add expense or transaction, and then we'll receive props and functions from our home screen. And if you look at the transaction card, we are going to display list of all transaction. As well, we'll have two different icons to perform delete and edit operation as we have seen in the demo. And then we'll call functions from our hook. Now, if you come here, I'll just explain this hook. A custom hook is basically going to be our data layer, and it's going to connect our UI components to our Supabase client. And in this custom hook, we'll have some state variable to manage states. And then we'll create CRUD functions like fetch expense, add expense, delete expense, and update expense. And then we'll be returning this to our UI components. Now, if we go down, we'll have also Supabase client. And this custom hook will make API queries because basically this function will be converted into a secure REST API by Supabase client. And Supabase client is primarily a way to interact with Supabase services like authentication, database operation. And authentication is really not in the scope of this video. We have already implemented that. And here we have the operation which we'll be doing. And these are the database operation: read, write, update, and delete. And we'll be performing this operation on our database or Postgres database. And here we'll have a table. We can call it transaction or whatever we want to name it. And then we'll have some attributes in our table or columns like ID. That's going to be something unique in order to identify the expenses. It's going to be the primary key. And then we'll have amount, we'll have category, description, and the timestamp. Now, Supabase client is also going to return a response, and that can either be an error or the data that we are fetching, or we can receive a success message. And this is it about the data flow. Now, this is the dashboard for our Supabase project. And if you look here, we have this that shows the status of the project and the total requests like the database request, authentication request, storage request, and real-time request. And I would like to show you two important things that you need to grab from here. So if you click on settings and you go to data API, it's going to provide us with Supabase URL And this is one of the important things that we will need in order to establish connection between our front end and the Supabase backend. And this one will be used by Supabase client. Now, one more that we need is going to be the API keys. And this API key, you can take publishable key or anonymous key. More or less, it's the same thing, just that this anonymous key is the old way of making connection to your Supabase, and the new way is the publishable key. And I will highly advise you to pick the publishable key because this is an old way and Supabase can disable it anytime. And that's why you can see it's written here legacy. And if I take you to my code editor, I'll just show you my Supabase client. It is within the lib folder. And this is the entire code for our Supabase client. And here we are going to make use of our keys, and we have stored it in our environment variable. And now this is one of the most important things that you have to be very careful about. You should not expose these keys to anybody. And one of the reasons why we added this to environment variable is when we are pushing our code to GitHub later, we can just add this file to git ignore and it will not be pushed. And I'm leaving this exposed just for teaching purpose. Now I'll just go back here to this Supabase client, and here we are going to validate our keys if they are there or if they are not there. Now, here we are going to export our Supabase client, and we are also going to perform some encryption and then store that data in our keychain for iOS, or we can store it in key store for Android. And this encryption is going to be possible through this Expo secure store. And we'll also persist the session. This is for login users, so that when the user login and closes the app and reopens the app, the user doesn't need to log in again. So this is persistent or just a memory. And this is it about the Supabase client. And now I'll take you back to the dashboard. And in the dashboard, we have this table editor. And in the table editor, we can either create our Supabase table manually simply by clicking here. And then we provide the table name. We can provide description for our table. And then we can come here, add attributes to the table, and then pick the data type for that attribute. And one of the most important concept is this row level security or RLS. You need to enable this so that your Supabase table becomes secured, because if it is not enabled, then if anyone has access to a Supabase URL, he or she can easily make queries. And that's why we need to declare some security policy by enabling this row level security. Now, the other way of creating your table is simply by going to SQL editor. And in the SQL editor, you can just create your table by typing some queries here, Postgres queries. Now we can start with our source of truth, and we need to create our Supabase table. So we'll just run some command here. And this is the query. So create table expenses. This is the table name. And then we need this attribute of ID, in which will generate some random UIDs. And then we need stamp. That's another attribute. And then we need user ID, amount, which is going to be of numeric data type, category, that's going to be of text or string. And then we need description. So we'll just run this query. And you can see success, no rows returned. That means our table is created. So we can just go to the table editor, and you can clearly see we have our expense table is created here. And then we have our columns or the attributes. Now, our table is not secure. We need to secure it. And that means we have to go back and enable what we call RLS, or the row level security. So for us to do that, we'll run this query. Now we need to alter the table in order to enable the RLS. Now the policy that we'll create is if a user is signed in or the user is authenticated, then they can manage their own expenses. That means if a user is not authenticated, then he or she should not have any access or be able to make queries to our table. And we'll run this query. And now the query is successfully executed. That means our table is now secured because RLS is enabled. Now we can start building our CRUD application. And the first thing that we need to do, let's just go to our data flow. We'll be using it as reference. And we have already created our table, expense table in Supabase. As well, the Supabase client is already set up. So we'll start from our custom hook and then going upward. So in the custom hook, we need to manage the state variable and then create our CRUD functions. And after that, we need to return the function. So we'll be doing all this step by step. So let me just go back to the code editor. And here inside the SRC folder, I'll try to create a folder called hooks for our custom hooks. And here I'll create a hook called use transaction. Now inside this hook, we'll need to import a Supabase from lib folder. Now we'll try to create a function here called use transaction. And inside this function, we need to manage some state variables. So I'll just create an array here. We'll have expenses, and then a setter that's going to be set expenses to track and manage the local state. So we need to import this hook from React. So I'll just come here. Okay, it's already imported. And here we just pass an empty array. Now we can start with the fetch operation. And for us to do the read operation, we need to create a function here called fetch expense. And it's going to be an async function. Now inside here, we need to destructure two states from Supabase, and that's going to be data and error. And then we await Supabase since this is an async function. Now we specify from our table is transaction table, expenses table. And from the expense table, we need to use this function from Supabase. It's called select. Now here you can either specify the columns that you need, but for our case, we are just going to select the entire table, select everything that is in the table, and then we can order that based on ID. It's going to be dot order, and we can set, let's say, ascending order. We set it to true so that we get the newest data first. And next we can check for the error. So to check for the error, we'll say if error, then we simply log the error message. Let's say failed to read expense, or let's say failed to fetch instead of read. Let's say failed to fetch expense, and then we log whatever internal error message that we have, and we return. And here we'll have set expenses. We update the local state. So this should return either data object or an empty array in case if nothing is in the table. We're getting this error argument of type any. Okay, the issue is because of the type. So we'll just head to our type folder and we'll try to create a file here. And we call it transactions. So we need to export the types for our transaction. Now here we'll first have an ID, and it's going to be of type number. Then we are going to have amount. That's going to be of type number as well. And then we need category. That's going to be of type string. And then we need one more. That's going to be description. And this should be optional. And it's going to be a type string or null. Great. Now we can come back here and we'll just import the types. And here we just pass our transaction types. Great. Now the error is gone. Now we can just log here if the data is fetched. So we just say expense fetch. And then log the data. Great. Now we need to go to our components and we try to create a component so that we can read the data. Now we create a folder here called cards. And then inside this card, we'll create a card called transaction card. Now we get the default template. And here we need to pass some props. So the first prop is going to be amount. And then we have category. And then description. These are the data that will be displayed in our card. And we just pass here the transaction type. We are basically destructuring the prop. And here we need to pass this prop. This will receive the props here. So first we'll receive amount. And just copy this. And paste it here. Next we'll have a, let's say, description. And on top here, I'll just receive this prop, and that's going to be category. Great. Now we can import our transaction card. But before doing that, let's just go back to our home screen. I'll just go to the app, tabs, and home screen. And here we need to import our hook. So it's going to be use transaction It's not giving me the suggestion. Probably we didn't export that. So we'll just come back here and we'll try to export this. Great. So now we can import this, and it's going to be from our hooks. And then use transaction function, and then we need to destructure that here. So we need to destructure expenses state and then fetch transaction. It's going to be fetch expense, not transaction. And this is complaining because we did not return them. So we'll just come here and return expenses and then fetch transaction. Fetch expense. Now it's fine. Now we can just come here and create a view component. And inside this view, we can now import our transaction card. Now we can go to transaction card and maybe give it view styling. So we'll give it with full. We'll give it a border, and you should see the border. Now we can give it border color to be gray, and it's going to be 300. And we can style the parent container. So I'll just come back to home screen, and here we'll style the home container, and let's give it a padding horizontal of 4 units, and you can see the card here. So I'll just come back to transaction card, and let's give it a background color of white. Nice. And padding of 4, and let's give it border radius to be XL. Great. Now we can come back to home, and let's give it margin top of 4. Great. Now we need to read data, and for us to do that, we'll have to perform some conditional rendering here so that we can have a clean way of fetching data. But before doing that, we need to have one more state variable here, and we are going to create a state variable, and I'll call it is fetching. And then we need a setter to set that. Great. Now we can also return this. And then we can come back to home, and in the home screen, we need to perform conditional rendering here. So if the state is fetching, then we simply return the loading spinner, and that's going to be some component called activity indicator. Now we need to pass some props here. So the first prop is going to be size, and for the size, it's going to be large. Next prop is going to be color. So we'll just give it a red color. And then lastly, we need to provide some styles here. So we use the standard React Native style sheet, and I'll give it a margin top. Let's say 40. Now, otherwise, we can just return and check for our expenses table. If we have data in our table, then we simply return that data and display it on our card. So we'll have that here. Let's just have our transaction card here. But before doing that, we need to actually map through the table. So I'll just say expenses dot map, and here we'll have item that's going to be of type any. Now we can display our transaction. Now we need to pass some props here. So the first prop is going to be key, and we'll say item dot id. Next we need a id, and id is going to be of, next is id, and then next we need to have a category. So we'll just say item dot category, and then we need a amount. And lastly, we need description. Great. Now, if nothing is found in the table, we simply return this text component. And this text component, we just say no expenses found in the table. And that's it. So now we need to go back, and let's just go to our use transaction and check. So before we read our data, we need to check the state here. So first we set is fetching to true, and then we set it to false in case we got an error, and after fetching data as well. So here will be false. Similarly here. Now we can go back to the home screen, and here we need to call our function. So for that we need to make use of use effect because we are going to deal with a side effect. I'll just wrap our fetch expense function inside this use effect, and the dependency array we pass nothing, and you can clearly see the loading spinner and it returned nothing is found. And this is because if I just take you back to our Supabase table, expenses table, nothing is found in the table because the table is empty, and that's how we create the read operation. Now we can go and perform the next operation, and the next operation is going to be create operation. And before we do that, we just need to go to our components, or maybe we can create a form here so that we can accept the entries, and I'll just call it a transaction form. Now this form will try to accept our entries. So the first entry that we are going to create, so let's just create some state variable here. So we'll have our category and then set category. And we initialize it to an empty string. So next we are going to have amount. So I'll just paste this and change this to amount and then set amount. And lastly, we have a description and then set description. Now we can come here and we need to get one more important component from React Native. It's called text input. This will allow us create some form, and here we are going to have the text input component. Now inside here we just need to have a placeholder, and the placeholder will just prompt the user to enter the amount. Let's say it's USD. Next we need to have the current state. That's going to be value, and value we just pass the current state. That's going to be amount, and then we need on change text, and this function is going to accept the setter. So we just pass here set amount. Now we can come to the home screen, and first we need to import our transaction form here. Great. Now we can go back, and you can clearly see we have this form for the amount. So we can go back and polish our transaction form. So here we'll just give it a class name, and then we can style this. So we're going to give it a border and border color. It's going to be gray, and you should see that here. Now we can give it a border radius. Let's just say XL, and padding horizontal. That's going to be 4 unit. Great. Now we can just copy this. Let's paste this here and repeat it, and then we change the content. So here it is going to be enter the category and then pass the current state. That's going to be category, and then the setter, set category. Now similarly here we are going to have the prompt as enter the description, and then value is going to be description, and then set description. And you can see we have our forms here. So I'll just come up here and try to style this form. Let's say margin bottom of 4. Okay, let's just say margin top. I mean, we can just give it gap, sorry. We can just give it gap of 2. Now it's great. So we need one important component, that's going to be the button component. So we import button component from React Native. And down here we need to pass this button component. And we pass this prop, title prop. And it's going to be add expense. Great. We can see here add expense, right? So now we can go to our use transaction hook, and here we are going to create the function to add expense. So I'll just say add expense, and it's going to be an async function. Now in this function we'll pass some parameters, and which is going to be this amount, category, and then description. We can structure it from our transaction types. So for this, let's just go back to transaction types, and we need to create here, we need to export a type called transaction input. Inside this transaction input, we are going to have these three properties, and it's going to be our parameter. So we just make this, we can come back here and just put here transaction input, and we import it. Now, we need to destructure states here. So we need data and error, and we simply await Supabase. Now, from our expenses table, we need to insert. Now, this is Supabase function that allows you to insert data, and it's going to be an array of objects. So first we'll have the amount. So we convert it to number because our input field usually treat this as a string. Next is going to be category. And then finally, we need our description. Great. Now we can check for the error. If error, we simply log that error message. Let's say failed to add our expense. And then log the message here. Great. And we simply return. Now, here we need to await fetch expenses or fetch expense function. And we need to have one more important state, and that's going to be loading. We have defined it here. So we can come here and we first check. If it's loading, we simply return. And we set loading to true. Otherwise, we can just set it to false. If we have error and we set it to false after we await fetch expense, now it's fine. Now we can go to our transaction form and we try to create a function here. But before that, we need to destructure and first import the hook. So we'll import here use transaction, and then we need to destructure here. So we need to get our add expense, and then loading. From use transaction function. Okay, let's just go back since we did not return them. So we'll just return them here. We'll have loading and then add expense. Great. Now we can come here. Now we need to create a function somewhere here. We create a function and we'll call it a handle add expense. And let it be async function. So here we need to await add expense. And then we pass those parameters. So we'll have here amount. And then we have category. And lastly, description. Great. Now we can come here in our add transaction. We can pass this prop on press, and then we pass the function as a callback function. Great. Now we can just try to add some expenses, but before that, I'll just polish the home screen a bit. I'll just come up here, and right here, I'll just have a text component, and I'll say today's expenses. Now we can style the text. So let the text be Excel, and the font is going to be, let's say, semi-bold. Great. Now we need to give gap here. So I'll just give it gap of 2. Nice. We can also style this text component. So let's just align this text to the center. Nice. And maybe give it a margin top Let's say 4. Nice. Now we can try this. Let's just enter some data here. I'll just put amount as 20 and category, I'll just say transport. And then I'll just say here trip to, let's say Shimla. And then add the expense. So it seems the expense is added. Let's just come here and also log some message. In case the expense is added, we just say expense is added successfully. And then we log that expense that is added. It's going to be data basically. And if you see here, we have transport, and then the amount is 20, and the trip is to Shimla. That's the description. So we need to implement a refetch. For that, I'll just come back here and I'll go to transaction form. And in the transaction form, I'll create some type here for prop. So I'll just say type transaction form prop. And here we need to create a prop, and I'll call this prop on success. And that's going to be a function basically. Now with this prop, I'll try to call it here on success function, and this is going to be C. We need to destructure that as well. So I'll just come here and I'll say on success. Destructure it from transaction prop object. Nice. So we can come to home, and in the home, we'll just pass the prop here. So on success, we just fetch expense, pass fetch expense function for the refetch. And you can clearly see the refetch is triggered. Now we can just go and polish this UI or the card to look a little bit better. So I'll just come here and I'll create here a view component. And inside this view component, I'll just take these two props and I'll just paste them here. And here we need to provide some styling. So I'll make a flex of row so that they're aligned in row. And then I'll give it justify in between so they have equal spaces in between. Great. You can see that, right? Now we can style our text. So I'll just style this. I'll say text is XL for the category. And you can see the text has been increased. And let's give it font to be semi-bold. Great. Now expense, the amount we can also style that. So let's say text is red. And the text is going to be XL. Great. And here we'll just put a minus dollar to indicate that it is an expense. And the trip to Shimla is here. That's going to be the description. Now we can also style this. Let's just give it a border left of 4. And then border left color is going to be red. Now the card looks way better. Now we can go back. I think by this the add operation is successful, but we need to address one elephant in the room. And it is that we do not have the validation here. So if we try to click on add expense, we are going to add some empty data to our database, and the database is going to accept that as a string. So we can just click on it and we see that. We can just see that we have logged an empty data to our database. And if you look at the terminal right here, we have this expense is added successfully and it is null, nothing, right? So for us to avoid that, we need to create some validation here. So I'll just come here to validate that amount and category is entered. Otherwise, we just return an error to the user. So we'll create some state here. I'll just call it error and then set error. Now I'll come back here and try to validate. So if category or the amount is not given, and for this we need to check. We'll just have to say amount. We need to convert it to type number. Then we simply return this error to the user, set error, and we'll say, please enter the details. And the next thing that we need to validate is the amount, if the amount is valid or not. So let's say if the amount is not a number, or if the amount is less than 0 or equal to 0. So if amount is less than or equal to 0, then we simply from the user to enter a valid. Let's say, please enter a valid amount, because we cannot accept 0 or minus, right? Now we can come here and we'll try to clear this. First, we need to clear the error after the entry is successful. So we'll say set error. And next, we need to clear the field after the entry is successful as well. So we'll have a set amount. And then we have a set description. And we also have set category. Great. Now here we need to run the error conditionally. So we do that here. So if we have error, we simply return this text error. Otherwise, if we do not have any error, we just return nothing. So it is going to be null. And we can style this. So let's say clear class name. And text is going to be red. Now we need to come here. Now, we actually forgot one thing. We need to return. Otherwise, we'll execute the next line. Similarly here, we just return. Now we can try to click. Nothing is there. So let's try to add expense. And we can clearly have this error that says, please enter the details, right? And we forgot to clear this description, so I'll just clear it. Now, we need to come back here, and we can just perform here conditional rendering for the title. For that, I'll just copy this. I'll just cut it, and here we'll check if it's loading. We simply return this, adding. Otherwise, we can just return add expense if nothing is loading. Oh, great. Now we can enter something here. So let's just say 2. And it's going to be entertainment. And here I'll say YouTube subscription. And now we can click on add, and you can clearly see it's adding. And the expense is added. So you can clearly see it's being read here. And this is it about the add or the create operation. And if I take you to our database table, I'll just reload this. I'll just refresh this. And you can clearly see we have these entries. We have the entry for the transport, entertainment, and an empty one. And by this, we mark the end of the add operation. So we can continue to the next operation. And now we have a red flag here. If you look at this button, it's stuck at adding. So we need to go back to our code editor and try to investigate that. And this is probably here in this use transaction. So this should initially be set to false. And similarly, after we are done with addition of the data, we also need to set this to false. And you can see now the issue is resolved. Now we need to go to the next operation, and the next operation is going to be the delete operation. So we'll just perform that right here. So I'll create here a function, and I'll call it a delete expense. And of course, it's going to be a synchronous function, and we need to pass ID number. Now, we need to destructure some states, and we only need error, and simply await Supabase. And from our table, that's going to be the expense table. We need to delete the data, so we do not pass anything to this function. Now, what we have to do, we're going to use this function in order to compare the ID of the data that we are going to delete, or the ID that we have passed to this delete expense function, with the ID of the items that we have in our table. So I'll just put that here, and here we'll have ID. Now, what we are going to do, we are going to check for error, and if we got any error, we simply log that error and just say failed to delete expense, and log the error message. Great. And we simply return. Now here in the local state, we are going to perform one operation that is basically to filter. So for that, we'll just say current. And we are going to say current dot filter. And inside here, we just pass our expense. And we'll say if expense dot ID is not equal to ID, So what we are doing here, we are filtering in order to make the delete. So we are going to compare this ID that we have passed to our delete expense with whatever ID that we have in our expense list. And if this ID is not matching with the ID that is there, we simply leave those expenses. Otherwise, if it is matched, then we delete it. So that's how the delete operation is going to work. And after that, maybe we can just log a message here that the item is deleted. Let's say our expense is deleted successfully. Great. Now we can go back to our transaction form, and we do not need to touch anything here. We just go to transaction CRUD. We need to create one more prop, but before doing that, we need to come up here and import some icon, and we'll do that from ion icon. Now I'll come here and I'll create a view component. And in this view component, I need a touchable opacity. Now in this touchable opacity, we'll have on press. That is going to accept a prop here, and we'll call that prop on delete. Now I'll go to the transaction types. I'll just go to transactions, and here I'll create one more prop and I'll call it on delete. And it's going to be a function. Now we need to destructure that prop here. So I'll just come here and pass this prop called on delete. Now I need to get the icon for delete. So I'll just import the ion icon, and the icon name is going to be, I think it's trash. And we can clearly see we have the trash icon. So let me just increase the size, and I'll give it 24. And you can see the delete icon here. So we'll just give it color, and it's going to be red. Now we can style this. I'll just give it a flex of row and justify end. Great, we have it here. So now we can go back to our home screen. So I'll just go back to the home tab. So we need to come here and pass one more prop, and that prop we'll call it on delete. And this on delete prop is going to accept this function, which is called delete expense. But before that, we need to destructure the delete expense here. Now, since we did not return it, so we'll just come here and return a delete expense. And now we can come back, and here we are going to delete the item based on ID. So I'll just say item. Okay, sorry. So I have delete expense here, and I'll come down here. I'll delete the item based on ID. So I'll just say item.id. Now we can give it a try, and the item is successfully deleted. And now we can go and perform the last operation, and that's going to be the update operation. So I'll just copy this entire function here, and then I'll paste it here and just make a few modifications. So the function name here will be update expense. And update expense, we are going to pass ID as well some updated data. So I'll just call this as updated data. Now in the updated data, we'll have amount. We are going to have category. And then we are going to have description. Great. So it's complaining because we need to pass type here. So this one is going to be type number, type string. And similarly here, it's going to be of type string. Great. Now we can come here in state of delete function. We are going to say update. It's going to be update, not updated. And we simply pass this updated data as an argument here. Great. And we are also going to make update based on ID. That's why we pass here the ID number. And after that, we are going to return the newly updated data. So we need the select, and then we change the format from an array of object to object. Now we can come here and say fail to update expense, and we just log the error and return. And for this one, we can just change this. So this is going to be, we'll just say current. And here we are going to map. So we'll say current dot map, and we map through this expenses. And now here we are going to say if expense dot ID is strictly equal to the ID, then we simply return the data object. Otherwise, we just roll back to expense. Great. And here we can just say our expense is updated successfully. So we also need to destructure our data, and we can return that as well. So we'll have here updated. We just say update our expense. Now we can come to our transaction form, and in the transaction form we are going to await our update. So for that we need to create here an if statement. But before doing that, we need to create here our some prop. So we'll have editing item, and that's going to be of type transaction or null. And we need one more, let's say clear editing, because we are going to use the existing form, and this is going to be a function. Now you can destructure that here. So we'll have here our editing item, and then clear editing. Now, if we are editing the item, then we simply return this, and this is going to be our update expense. This should be await, because it's an asynchronous function, await update expense, and we are going to say editing dot id, comma. Now we pass the parameters of the items to be updated. So we'll have our amount, we'll have category, and then we'll have description. Great. Update expense cannot find. So we need to destructure that from our use transaction. So I'll just come here. I'll just say update expense. Great. Amount is complaining. The amount is complaining, so let's convert it to type number. Great. Else we can just return await add expense function. Great. So now we need to come up here, and here we are going to perform the logic in order for the user to edit the expense. And in case the user is editing the expense, we simply fill this form with the existing data. So for that, we'll just make a use effect here. Now we'll say if editing item, then we simply perform this operation. We'll just say set amount, and it's going to be editing item dot amount, and we convert it to a string because it's going to be in the input field, and this input field is going to accept a string, or the data type is going to be of type string, and that's why we need to convert the amount back to a string. After that, we need to fill this category form with the existing category. So I'll say set category. It's going to be editing item dot category, and lastly we have description. We also need to fill the field with the existing description, editing item dot description. Well, and this one is going to be either null, for that we just pass this space here. Great. We just pass this empty string. Now in the dependency array, we need to pass our editing item. Great. Now we need to go to our transaction card, and here we need one important icon, and I'll just put this icon here, and I'll call it, I think the icon is create outline. Yeah, and let's just give it a green color. And here we are going to create prop called on edit, and just copy this. And then I'll go to the transaction, and I'll come here. We'll have this as a function called on edit. Great. Now we can come back to transaction form. Now here we need to pass the clear editing function. Now we can come back to our home, and in the home we need to pass some props here to these components. So if you look here, the transaction form is expecting some prop to be passed. So we need to first create some state variable here, and I'll call it editing item and then set editing item. Use state, and here we just pass the transaction type, or it can be null. And here is not empty array, sorry, here should also be null. Great. Now just delete this, and we need to import a use state hook from React. As well, we need to import the transaction type. So I'll just say import our transaction from types. Great. Now we can come here, and here we'll just say editing item is equal to editing items, and then we need to clear the editing item, and we can do that simply by calling set editing item and pass null here. Great. Now we can come here and we pass the prop on edit, and this on edit prop, we pass our function set editing item, and we just pass the item. Great. Now let's try to edit the item by clicking on edit, and now you can see all these fields have been filled with the existing data, and this is what we have been doing basically here in the transaction form. It was this part. Now we need to go to the home screen, I mean in the transaction form, and we need to perform some conditional rendering here so that we can have the cancel button here and the update button somewhere here. So for us to do that, we need to come here, and maybe we can create a view component here, and inside this view now we can render this cancel button, and it's going to be if cancel button, then we simply return a view component with a button here. We just import a button component. Now we can style this, so we'll give it a flex of 1, and let's say margin right of 2. Now we can pass the button here, but before that we need to create also a function here. So I'll just create a function called handle cancel, and in this function we just set everything to empty field. So we'll just set amount to an empty field, because if we want to cancel our edit, we just return this field to empty field without anything in it. So we'll just set amount and then set category, and we also pass this as empty, and then we have set a description that's also going to be empty, and I think this is it. So we can come, or we can also pass a clear editing function. Now we can come back here. In this button we are going to have a title, and the title is going to be cancel. Now on press we just call our handle cancel function, and then maybe we can give it a color that's going to be gray. Nice. And I'll come here and just create another view component. So I'll just copy this button and wrap it inside this view component. Now here we can just give it a flex of 1. Great. Now we need to update this button as well. So I'll just come here and I'll just cut this part. And here we'll just return if we are editing item, then we simply return the text. And here it's going to be updating, or else we just return this, and here it's going to be adding, or else we can return this. In case we are editing, we'll go with the second option, and that's to return we'll have update, or else we simply return add expense. Great. Now we can come back here, and here we are going to create a class name, and we give it a flex of row, justify between, and then we give it a width full. And now let's try to edit this. So you can clearly see if we press on cancel, we can cancel the edit, or else you can just update the value. So I'll just increase this to 25 as the amount and click on update, and you can see the item is successfully updated. And this is it about the CRUD application that we have created today. If you really enjoyed the video, kindly give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Peace.